Play the drop.
Ass to ass. Ass to media. I wanna see you watching ass to media. I wanna see you reading ass to media. I wanna see you hearing ass to media. Ass to ass.
Ass Media is the segment where we give book, TV, podcast, film, video game reviews that relate to sex, love, dating, and or gender. They're typically spoiler-free reviews. I'm not sure what this one is, but Rodecka's going to tell us a little bit more.
This one is spoiler free, okay? I am going to get on my soapbox a little bit. I don't know if you guys noticed before the break, I did mention a couple of times, I sprinkled it here and there. I was like, I'm excited for this game, Cyberpunk 2077. I think I've said it maybe 3 or 4 times. If you're a Patreon, I've definitely said it more than that. I'm like, I'm not doing nothing. Cyberpunk is my life now, starting December 10th. I did say that. I was one of those people. So I'm coming from a place where I am a huge fan. I am someone who, before December 10th, you couldn't tell me shit. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. So in case you didn't know, Cyberpunk 2077 is a 2020 action role-playing game developed and published by CD Projekt Red. Furthermore, they will be referred to as CDPR. CDPR, because it's a long name. Anyway, the story takes place in Night City, an open world set in the cyberpunk universe. Players assume the first-person perspective of a customizable mercenary known as V, who can acquire skills in hacking and machinery with options for melee and range combat. So for my review of Cyberpunk 2077, the first half, I'm going to talk about how buggy and just a general disappointment this game was to the gaming world at large. But then in the second half of my review, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth on a bunch of reasons why I personally felt like this was a disappointment. And from a Black feminist perspective, it's a lot of racism, caricature, sexism, transphobia, and xenophobia. It's a lot. So we're definitely going to talk about all of that. So if you know about this game at this point, it released when we were on break, but at this point, you know that Cyberpunk was not at all what anybody was expecting it to be. If you don't know about this game, the long and short of it is it's one of those things that was hyped to be the changing of gaming landscape. Like, no exaggeration, this game, if you think about, I don't know, The Matrix, right? In terms of cinema, it was like supposed to be genre bending, mind blowing, and it's not like me. It's gamers thinking this was it. This was the holy grail of gaming, and then it failed. It failed in many ways. I played the PC version. It came out on different platforms: PC, PS4, Xbox One, and then the new generation, which is PS5 and Xbox
Can you
Series
say, and then
X.
the new generation? Because you had hit your.
The new generation of consoles, which is Xbox.
No, you don't have to explain.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I would just, the same way you said it, it's just because you bumped your mic when you said it.
Oh, my bad. Yeah. So then it also came out in the new generation, the Xbox Series X and PS5. And I played on the PC specifically because I wanted to get into PC gaming because it's like this like elitist culture, but like it's actually pretty cool where you can just like swap out different things instead of buying a whole new system every 4 or so years. It's been 10 years, but yeah. So I was fortunate to play it and also finish the game. It was not without gameplay bugs or visual bugs or sound bugs. And then there was also magical cops who popped in as soon as your character commits a crime, which in video games is not a thing. Usually there's like a progression. There's a cop on the corner and then it's like, oh, I saw you do this, as opposed to like, I'm in an enclosed building on the 8th floor and somehow a cop magically appeared in a closet. That is a bug. That is not something that should happen. And that's what was happening in this game. And I personally was waiting for this game for 8 years. That was when the teaser popped up on YouTube. It was just one person. It was like 10 seconds and everyone was like, holy shit, this is gonna be amazing. And even though I was underwhelmed by the customization screen, which to me is the favorite part of any video game, I will spend an hour and a half on that customization screen because that person is the person I want to create and I want to get into it. All the way to the credits, I was just like, ooh, okay. I had the privilege to laugh it off because in 2020 everything was kind of disappointing. So I was like, no surprise here. It just is what it is. I'm rolling with it. But for other people, because I was playing on PC, I could laugh it off and be like, wow, there's a floating cigarette in the middle of this conversation. Okay. That's weird. But for PS4 and Xbox One players, they were met with a game that was virtually unplayable. They turned it on, crashed straight to the main screen. They had cars that were flying across the screen. And even though this was set in 2077, cars flying across the screen wasn't because of flying cars. It was because it was being flinged across the whole city, and your character might be in the way of it. And it was like, wait a minute, this is not the way that's supposed to be. And there was also game breaking bugs, just things that, like, in an RPG, a role playing game specifically, you're supposed to be immersed. You're basically pretending that you are this character and you're living their life. So, a floating cigarette for me is like, that's funny, but a car crashing in the middle of a dialogue of a really important, supposed to be sentimental scene is like immersion breaking. And that's just not something that you want, because you're like, I'm out of it now and it's not really something I'm enjoying anymore. So bad was this mess that Cyberpunk was that Sony, which I've seen other news. I'm obsessed with video game news. I love watching buggy videos. There have been buggier games, but Sony, it was so bad because of the promise that was delivered and all that stuff. Sony actually pulled it off of their PlayStation Store, which means we're giving you refunds. If you don't want this game anymore, we're giving it back. And for a company that, at the end of the day, the bottom line is money, to take it off, it was a big deal. And it was no exaggeration to say that for a lot of people, specifically in this decade, but also gamers alike, the way that it turned out was so heartbreaking for people, because I know people personally who were using this game as a vehicle to almost save themselves from the mess that 2020 was. It was almost like, look, as long as Cyberpunk comes out this year, everything's going to be okay. And that's really like, that was a rhetoric across the board. And when it came out and it was just like this disappointing thing, it was just like, of course, but it was really like almost a hopeless feeling. But then also on top of that, you can't talk about Cyberpunk without talking about the developer behind it. So CD Projekt Red, or CDPR, is the game studio behind the Witcher series, where I talk about it all the time. It's my favorite series. It's now a movie show, a TV show. A lot of people are interested in it, but the developer themselves were considered kind of the darlings of the gaming world, because like EA, Ubisoft, a lot of companies are known to be about money. Mm-hmm. And granted, it's all about money behind it, but at least CD Projekt Red, you never felt like you were in it for the money. It felt like they were really listening to gamers, and they could really do no wrong as a company. They were just like, you know what, you guys are listening. And then when we said something, it was added to the game. And that's not something that you really see across the board. A lot of times it's like these microtransactions, or you feel like you know that your wallet is what they're aiming for. But with them, it was just like, they're listening to us. They love us. These are the gamers. So it was so much so like this halo effect where like they could do nothing. That when CD Projekt Red, it was revealed that in the last month before release, they were doing crunch. So if crunch is a practice where developers are forced to work nearly around the clock to finish a game, which is unethical across the board, because you have a 5-day work week. They're doing it pretty much 7 days a week. You can sleep where you can fit in, but it's like your job. If you've ever heard like, you can't come in for this shift, but I would highly encourage you to do it. And you know that your job is in jeopardy if you don't show up. Mm-hmm. So that's what crunch is. And it's something that they promised that they would never do. And then they ultimately, someone in the company actually released the email saying like, hey, we're doing around the clock stuff. You need to do this. And everyone kind of like defended them because of the fact that they were just like known to be these good guys. So they're like, there must be a reason why you guys signed up for the job. So you must know this is what it is. All of that. It was crazy. But it was one of those things where a lot of people were still having these rose-colored glasses about CDPR, as opposed to thinking, okay, this is weird for them. This is weird for just a game to be forcing people to work around the clock, essentially. So it turns out, and we all found out by now, that CDPR was a lot more unethical in a lot of ways than we could have ever even imagined. So when they ended up releasing the games to reviewers, reviewers usually get like a copy for every platform. Reviewers usually get, I gotta stop hitting the mic. So reviewers usually get a copy for each platform. They get like PC, the old consoles, and the new ones, right? So it was very strange. And you noticed that they were only saying you can only get it for PC. Like it was not going to be for any of the consoles, even though they touted it as something that was going to be for last generation and current generation. They were like, look, if you're reviewing the game, it's only going to be for PC, which was weird. But it turns out that it was intentional. It's because, as I mentioned before, for PS4 and Xbox One, this game was virtually unplayable, and they knew it. And that's what ultimately led to refunds, because they were like, not only did you not give out the review codes, you were aware of how bad it was, and you were trying to hide it so that people would get these 10 out of 10 reviews, 9 out of 10 reviews, and then ultimately buy a game that when they play it actually a lot of reviewers redid it and gave them 2 out of 10 reviews, 1 out of 10 reviews, because of the fact they were like, wait a minute, this is bad, like the worst that you can think of, which is good. But then I noticed personally, because I was one of those people, given this is the same company that has made my favorite game, and I can't change the fact that that's my favorite game, Witcher 3. But this is something where I'm looking at them and I'm like, I remember something else in the marketing besides like, this is going to be a great game for these generations. I also remember it being almost a media fire about one specific thing. And to me and something that I thought was incredible was this genre bending, gender bending a portion of the game that they really touted heavily in the media, that when I played, I noticed was completely different than what they were selling us. So if you search the words CDPR, CD Projekt Red, with gender, you will find, I kid you not, hundreds of articles claiming that the developer was going where no game has gone before. In an IGN article from August 2019, you can read CD Projekt Red is doing away with traditional gender options in Cyberpunk 2077 to keep the cyberpunk ethos of the genre. They said that developers are working to make Cyberpunk 2077 really inclusive. They made sure to say that, and that anybody who's playing will feel like they can make their own character, whether or not they're non-binary. Really just throwing out all the words that you're like, oh shit, you're looking at me, you know who I am, you're thinking about me as a character in RPG where I'm not usually represented, and you're saying we're going to represent you. Literally looking at the LGBTQ community and saying, we want you to play this game because you are included here. During E3, which is the electronic gaming expo, which is like this big thing that happens. It's been canceled a couple of times, but they paraded an ad heavily that prominently featured a trans character. They also leaned heavily in the inclusivity angle by having NPCs, which are non-playable characters, other characters in the universe, refer to the character that you're playing by V instead of by gender. All things that they made sure to say like, hey, we see you, you're in it, play this game, have a good time, you know? And it wasn't far away from what the cyberpunk genre is in general. It's all about customization. You're supposed to be imagining a future where technology is at the forefront, and you can pretty much anything that you've ever wanted to do with your body, whether or not you wanted these add-ons, these cybertronics, this skin, this, that. That's what this universe is supposed to be about. You can change who you are. So it wasn't even out of line. Like, you can think of a game like GTA where it would be strange to be thinking in terms of inclusivity, because this is a problematic game where, you know, we killing everybody and doing all type of stuff, as opposed to cyberpunk where the genre pretty much aligns with this idealism. It's a style of science fiction birthed from the ambition around race and gender and sexuality through the lens of rapid modernization. So at the time, like I said, it's 100% that my character wouldn't have to align with this gender binary. Mm-hmm. But again, about all things surrounding this game, it was a farce. There was nothing. There was nothing like this. They tried. But there was an article in The Gamer that I feel like explained this perfectly, and it was published in July 2020. And they noticed the cracks before the game was even released. They noticed that CD Projekt Red intended to differentiate the character by voice. So it wasn't like you could just choose and then everything that came afterwards was just what you did. It was like you either had a feminine voice or a masculine voice, which as you hear it, you're like, That's exactly the opposite of what we were trying to do here. If you chose a feminine voice, you were automatically considered female and you were automatically referred to as she and her. There was no if, ands, or buts about it. No matter
Wow.
how you customated your character, the feminine voice was automatically she and her. The masculine voice was automatically he and him, which is what's different about that. What about our society, which you already know, we already correlate certain tones and pitches and cadences as a problematic way to masculine or feminine, which is what we're trying to do away with, because even cis people whose voices don't necessarily fit their birth gender have a hard time navigating speech. And the point is that codifying gender and sexuality by voice is inherently problematic. So you just did exactly what you any other video game would have done, as opposed to, actually it's a little bit worse because I played Saints Row 3, which is a good example of like you choose the gender, but you can make the voice whichever way you want. There's almost archaic in the way that they're deciding to do this, even though they use the angle of we're going to be inclusive. um so to me, I'm not a coder, but I feel like it's almost easier to take away the correlation and make it where it's just like a free for all, and it
Mhm.
can go which way or the other, as opposed to like, yep, feminine voice, she her, masculine voice, he her. And
She
that was
him.
one thing. But then on top of that, he him. Sorry, I said he her. Um, and then there was no non-binary option, even though they mentioned it. So there was no they them option. There was no middle ground. It was just the binary. So it was like, why did you say this? But then on top of that, for me, something that I noticed was I was really into this game. So I was reading about the world before that. I had a book. I have a book where I'm like, ah, shit, we getting into this, whatever. And they talk about the gangs in the world. Um, and one of the gangs is called the Voodoo Boys, right? And I'm like,
Yikes.
okay, great. It's the only Haitian representation in the game. And I already know that my culture doesn't get a lot of accurate representation in general, i.e., Bad Boys 2, the Haitians who are the bad guys, but they're smoking hella weed and going mon, and I'm like, I don't know who this is supposed to be, but I guess that's me. Okay. In this one, it's the Voodoo Boys, of course, who in the first scene you see them, they're chopping off chicken heads and wearing it as necklaces. Oh, yeah, exactly. And like the face is almost like, really? Okay, this is supposed to be the future where everything's different. But it doesn't stop there. It's also the Valentinos, which is the Latino Chicano culture. Their covenant culture, their tattoos, they have the Santa Muerta and the Jesus figures everywhere. Spanish words are just thrown into every sentence, and it's like hombre and this and that. Okay, every character is like that. There's no nuance, even though we could be anything that we want. There's the Moxies, who are a gang of sex workers. Everyone's half naked. They're walking around like, ooh, yes. Then there's the Animals, which is a gang primarily made of black and brown characters that are
Oh.
primarily known for doping and using animal supplements to push themselves to peak physical or bestial condition to portray.
Oh.
Okay. And then there's the Tiger Claws, where, in my opinion,
Oh my
is the
God, this
worst.
is
Every one of them is wielding a katana.
oh my
They all know martial arts. They have glowing tattoos, street bikes, and they all reside in Japantown. It's
wow.
literally the equivalent of J.K. Rowling's Cho Chang, where it was just like, all right, we're gonna throw whatever. And it's everything, is every single character is a racial caricature. And it's like, you're supposed to have me believe that this is the future where everything can be something other than they're being portrayed as. But I'm looking at these archaic ideals of the 80s, of this, well, shit, well, earlier than that, where cyberpunk really originated in the 80s. But it's like this Japanophobia, this fear, where like the main plot is like Japanese people are coming in with their new technology and taking over America. And I'm like, that is this World War II? Is this like what's going on? So it's like people focus on the disappointment of literally the game being trash, but there were so many ideals that were supposed to be like, let me look forward to a future where things are different, and you're literally showing me if not the same, but worse. And every representation is like, seriously? Like, if my character can be anyone, why is every character exactly the way that the media wants? The stereotypes that we have to digest daily are just being reinforced in this game. And it sucks because people think to themselves like it's just a video game, but it's a media, it's a form, and it's just something that all eyes were on this. There's not a person who likes video games that doesn't at least know about Cyberpunk. So it's like, I'm a Haitian person where I was on Reddit and people were like, I don't see the big deal. The creator's black, and I'm like, what?
As if
The
black
creator's
people
not a
aren't some
Haitian.
of the most anti-Haitian motherfuckers I've ever experienced.
Exactly. It's these conversations that are happening, and the transphobia, the racism, the stereotyping, the characterization of these groups, and that can never be anything other than what the media portrays them as. This game failed on a huge platform and in every other subset of just like marginalized groups who might have been looking for some semblance of representation that was accurate to what they know. And I remember, like, I want to say there was Samoan tattoos that were used out of context. There was a lot of things that was just like almost as if nobody was consulted.
Mm,
Nobody was asked, hey, is this the right way to do this?
mm.
And in scrambling to finish this game that they promised, they also really betrayed a lot of people who were looking at this as something to uplift these groups and really just say, hey, we see you, but I see you as what you are on TV, and I never even like tried to look deeper than that. And this is supposed to be the future. So a lot of people were just looking forward to a dismal future. But they did make sure to emphasize, if you look up CDPR or Cyberpunk 2077 with penises, you're gonna have a whole lot of articles, and that's the most exciting things. We're gonna have some penises on characters that shouldn't have penises. And that's it. That's the saving grace. But go ahead, Aku. I'm sorry.
Do you know why there was this crunch? Because the trailer came out 8 years ago. What have y'all been doing in the past
So
8 years?
that was the thing,
I have
and
a
that's
question.
Cyberpunk was supposed to be released. I want to say the first time they ever really gave a release date, and don't quote me on this, was maybe 2018. But really, the concrete release date was April 2020. Then it got delayed to November of 2020. I will not say that every gamer is this calm person where it's just like you do the game wherever you want to. When they delayed it again from September to December, they received death threats. Like, people were actually angry about the fact that they did it. So the crunch really occurred because they didn't want to have to tell people again that they were going to delay the game. And it's really the higher ups, the corporation, not the developers themselves, because the developers are just people who, I have ownership of this alleyway that I designed. And, they're not people who are deciding when things are released. They're just making a game until the corporation above them says, you don't have to make the game anymore. Um, so the crunch really happened because they wanted to deliver something fast enough, and there was so much hype around this game. To say, hey, we're going to release it in 2021 or 2022 felt like they were going to lose a lot of money. They felt like they were going to lose fan base. And granted, they might have, but in no way near as bad as they would have now. So the crunch in and of itself was because most AAA games, which are like the big ones, like Last of Us 2, like games that are like you see them everywhere, as opposed to like independent games, there is a degree of crunch that is involved in playing the game, and people mostly look over it, but which sucks, and it's something in the community that we shouldn't allow at all. But with CD Projekt Red, it was so publicized because they promised it wouldn't happen because they knew it was unethical.
Mm.
But it's if you don't give a timeline that leaves enough breathing room, what's going to happen is you promise people December, and by November you realize there are huge cracks in the game that you cannot fix. So the only way that it can be fixed is if people work all the time. And obviously it didn't help anyway. But yeah, it was because of pressure, because of money. The same thing that happens with almost every business, but people expected them to be above that.
Mhm.
Yeah. And to me, it's just like, I think I really wanted to highlight that because a lot can be said about bugs, and people are really focusing on that. But I remember being so excited because of the fact that they they didn't have to say, even though you hope that everyone says it or mentions it, they didn't have to say that they were trying to be inclusive, that they were trying to make something that you can look forward to in the future and think this is like, even though it was a little dystopian-esque, it wasn't like, oh, this is going to be the brightest future ever. There were still things that they mentioned where it was like, we will be inclusive. We will consider people who have never been represented in media, only for me to open my customization screen and want to select eyebrow 18 and it is locked to a female character. You didn't have to say those things. And now my expectation is this, only to be told that this is the same game, if not worse than, because I've played a game where I don't have to be locked to a binary before. So it's not impossible. You said you were going to do it, only to not do it. And it only makes me think, in the same vein of this, not giving the reviewers this PC code, it's almost to bring people in to get that money, and knowing what people want, only to slap them in the face and saying, you ain't getting that shit. I ain't giving it to you. But thanks for coming. Thanks for your money. And it really sucks because you just don't expect it. And to pander to these crowds only to take their money, it's just shitty. It's just shitty. Yeah, but
Sam had a question.
yeah, what's up?
I didn't have a question so much as a linkage to what, first of all, thank you for that extensive unpacking of Cyberpunk 2077.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for bringing video games to Interho Uprising for the first time.
Always here. Let's
Cool.
go.
Doing things.
Ask Media is changing it up a little bit. But to link it back to what I said earlier about how the myth is that capitalism drives innovation, and here we have another instance of that absolutely doing the opposite of that. And it back to my point of just dragging these rich ass motherfuckers who people think are geniuses. It reminds me of the work practices that Elon Musk does at Tesla, where it's like he thinks of these really huge ideas, like, oh, we're gonna produce 1 million, that's probably not the number, but like a very large amount of like roadsters by X, Y, and Z date. And the people at his company are like, how the fuck are we gonna do that? We can't even feasibly think about how we're going to do that by this date. And then him coming down to, I think it was the Washington Post that wrote expose about this, him coming down to like the factory floor and being like, where are you at with this? And people being like, nowhere, nigga, like we can't get there that fast. And him firing people on the spot and like forcing, honestly, other people who work for him to do these kinds of like similar crunches because they're scared of losing their jobs, and knowing that there's such a high turnover rate for engineers that they'll be able to like refill those roles. Yeah, so that really reminds me.
CDPR, it's funny that you mentioned Elon because I said Elon like me and this nigga on first name basis, but anyway,
I mean, he don't deserve the respect of a Mr. Musk.
That's a fact.
First of all, that nigga's transphobic in and of himself, but talking about, oh, I want a better world and I can imagine all these things, but you can't even imagine how to fucking call somebody their pronouns, but you want to name your son X, Y, and Z 1, 2, 3. Fuck you. Go ahead. Sorry.
But I'm supposed to acknowledge your son by whatever, computerized name you generated. But CDPR, it turns out, has like quoted or retweeted things from Musk, and people were like, okay, your ideals are a little shady. But then on top of that, I forgot it. It was, you said something about coming down on the floor and when is it done? Yes. So people from the developers specifically who received death threats and had no idea, they found out about the time that the game was delayed at the same time as everyone else, at the same time as the general public. They found out that their game was supposed to be, that they knew in of themselves that wasn't ready to be done. They found out that it was being delayed by just 2 months. And they were like, wait a minute, we didn't think the game was going to be done. What do you mean? So they're on the same vein where it's just like, you're making these promises to the people and they have no idea how it's going to get done. And I can't even imagine how that must feel, where you're like, okay, you're doing your job. I'm coding this character, right? I'm doing all this type of stuff. And it's nowhere near finished. But you find out in an email that not only are you going to be working around the clock, but you have a deadline that is impossible. So people are coming forward now and saying, we never thought that this was something that could be possible, but we don't have a choice. And you find out that, these darlings of the industry are just like everyone else. And I think for people who don't know the impact of gaming culture, and even if you do, you don't realize how huge it is for everyone and how serious it is, and lives that are affected by just one video game, because it's so serious as a media, as a culture, as everything, but it's never so serious as to like
Send
you
somebody a
telling
death
me
threat.
you make arrangements with your family because you're not going to see them for 4 weeks because you're going to be in the studio, sleep here, basically. Granted, obviously but they went from like a 5-day work week to like 6.5 days. And it's just like it's really serious. There's a lot going on behind the scene, and it was just a letdown through and through, both from an ethical standpoint, and just like a video game standpoint, which is bad all across the board. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was a ride.
Oof.
That was
I
a
had,
journey.
yeah. I didn't realize that. I think I was so like underwhelmed, but also realizing how disappointed I was when I started, because there were so many things that I feel like were a letdown to me. That, granted, when doing research, I realized other people noticed about the transphobia and the racial caricature. So it's good not to be alone. But then there were so many other people who were just like, it's just a video game. But also, those were the same people who last week, before any of those things were an issue, were like, this is video game is going to change my life. You know what I mean? It's to switch up, and nothing is ever just a video game. The reference of like, okay, what can someone pull up in media to say, how does a Haitian person operate? How do they, what is their culture? What are their standings? They can pull up now Cyberpunk, and this footage of someone, the first thing they're saying is chopping off a chicken head and putting it around their neck, and everyone practice voodoo in this world where anybody's skin can be green, anybody can do anything they want. They're all black people, dark skinned people wearing chicken bones around their neck and doing all type of stuff. That's the representation that I have. And then there's bad boys too. So it's just like, granted, I know my culture, but this is all anybody else will ever know, you know? And then that doesn't just stop there. It's also the Latino representation. It's also the Japanese representation. Why is everyone wielding katanas, no martial arts? Everyone? What is this?
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. That is
Yeah. Come
no
on.
no media.
Even as you hear it, it's like, I feel like I didn't even have to flesh it out, because when you hear it, you're like, come on now. So, and that was, man, I feel like going back to the optimism of old Rodecka and recordings like Cyberpunk, and now this is what it is. This is what it turns out to be, this dumpster fire of just like everything that you can possibly think of is thrown in there.
Yeah.
And it's horrendous.
Well, thank you for that
Of course.
unpacking, because I would have never known, and now I know.
Yes,
See?
thank you for that.
Akua, I do it for you. Always.
We don't have time for such conversations, but there's a conversation to be had about what does ethical gaming look like,
Yeah.
or
Oof.
ethical consumption of games. And there's also a conversation to be had about like fake and false futurism that Elon Musk and I think the creators of this game both fall into, because it's all we imagine a different world until it's like imagining a world outside of cisgender, straight, able-bodied white people.
Yes.
And if you're black, even if you're black, you can
Yes.
still do that exact same thing.
Yes.